Let's speak firstly to Hannah Peaker, Deputy Chief Executive of the New Economics Foundation, a progressive think tank focused on promoting social, economic, environmental justice through policy research and advocacy. There we go. There's a title, Hannah. Good afternoon to you.
Hi, Ian. Thanks
I hope you haven't got all of that written on a name badge.
I tried, but it doesn't fit.
Nice to have you with us. I mean, this is always, for any government, we spoke to Damien Green yesterday, of course. Previously, he had the job in the DWP under the Tories. It's kind of the impossible gig, isn't it?
Welfare, you mean? Broadly.
Yeah, I'm trying to make it fair, because depends on who you ask, depends on their definition of fair, and trying to, even if you want to make it fair, but to make it fair but reduce the costs, that's the bit that really stumps most governments, because it's almost impossible.
Well, I think the interesting thing about welfare is, the public really believes in the principles of it, that it should be, support should be available to people when they need it, and that we all might need that safety net at some point in our lives. The complex thing is, welfare is also where all your other problems show up. So, underinvestment in the NHS, austerity, pull back on council services. That decade that we had of underinvestment turns out that it leads to all kinds of problems, and that shows up in welfare. So you've seen an increase in the number of claimants, an increase in the number of people experiencing ill health or having a disability. And I don't think that's something we should be surprised by. We've got a memory loss when it comes. But
is it? Is that a way of just going? Oh, it's all George Osborne's fault because once upon a time he tried to shave £2.50 off the welfare bill, didn't really work. When all the other Tories took over, they piled loads of money back into it. COVID, they piled loads. No government in our history, I think, has spent more money in this area in giving away taxpayers' money than, oddly, the last Tories. Not because they, are lovely people, but because that's just the way it happened.
Well, one of the interesting things is that, the growth in claimants has an awful lot to do with the fact that we changed the retirement age. That's what I mean. You adjust something somewhere else, it will show up in your welfare bill. You then have people who are eligible for welfare and not in receipt of their pension for a number of years. So, but I do think it's fair to say that there were consequences to austerity. It didn't lead to the objectives that it stated. It didn't bring down the debt. And it did lead to rising inequality and poverty. And also a lot of those services that get withdrawn in that moment, and we're seeing that now with the spending review as well, are preventative services. So if you're not preventing these things, then the consequences start to manifest and they lock in. And I think what the government was trying to do, which is the right ambition, is to say we want more people to have the opportunity to work. I think most people would agree with that too. And we want people to not be poorly and not be unwell. And those are important ambitions. How you do it is what matters. And I think the problem with how this has been done is you had this kind of, they set the target, the savings target first, and then worked backwards from there. That's not typically how you design good policy. And I think what you're seeing in the rebellion is not just a pushback against the cuts that are being proposed, but a pushback against the idea that we should be designing policy to meet fiscal rules rather than designing policy to meet people's needs. And it was sort of rushed through, this very clunky thing. We had the white paper, which offers some really good ideas from Labour about how it might want to reform employment services, a lot of which we supported. We had increased investment in the NHS, also a really good thing if you want to support people back into work. And then we suddenly had this quite rushed thing, proposal around how they were going to reform welfare. The OBR then disagreed with the number they were going to get on the saving. We then had justifications that were, it's going to make the welfare state more sustainable. We had justifications that were about cost savings, that are about fairness within the system. There's never been a coherent point. The kind of lasting point was that it was designed to give Rachel Reeves that bit of headroom that she was seeking. And that's not a serious way to engage in reforming support so that it enables people back into the workplace. So if that's what we want, this isn't how you do it.
And what I was saying at the beginning, before we started discussing this, Hannah, was that this is, the money was to reduce the increase in spending. It wasn't about fundamentally trying to say, look, we're going to get rid of PIP or something like that. And of course, if you're in that job, which is what I was getting at earlier, then you really have two choices, don't you? You've either got to say, look, we're living in a world for whatever reason, the reasons that you just outlined at the beginning, could be lots of other socio-economic reasons, whatever. We've got big mental health crisis, physical health, mental health. All of this is going on. You know, we either pay to assist people or we don't. That's really the choice, isn't it? You know, we do or we don't.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's complicated now and what MPs are not accepting is the change in rationale. So either these payments, which are not linked to employment, they're about supporting you with the additional costs that you might face because of disability or ill health, they're either justified or they're not. Now what we've got a situation is they're justified for the cohort that's currently getting those payments, but they won't be for anybody who develops a disability or ill health and doesn't meet the new quite stringent criteria. And that's, you know, we do get that a little bit when you have a change in the way we deliver benefits. You expect a different system than the one is being rolled out, but it's sort of unjustifiable to do it in that way. And the really frustrating thing is they've said, look, we're listening, we're hearing what you're saying, and we're going to do a review, and we're going to work out whether this is the right way to structure this. But that review will conclude right at the point that having passed this bill, if it goes through, those changes will be coming into effect. So it feels a little bit like you're just, you know, kicking the can. How can the outcome of that review have any effect on what happens?
And that is, that's what you do, isn't it? You call a review and you say, well, we'll wait for the review. And, you know,
and they should have started with the review.
Just wait, start with the review. Done it the wrong way around. Listen, Hannah, great to have you on. Thank you. Hannah Peake, Deputy Chief Executive of the New Economics Foundation. Let's speak with Matthew Torbitt, former Labour advisor. This is going to go through this evening, Matthew. Good afternoon to you, by the way. But there'll be how much of a kicking does Keir Starmer get? I guess that's the first question.
I think it's a challenge to his authority, and it will likely be the largest rebellion he's had, whether that be in opposition or in power. And I think what a lot of these backbenchers have probably done now is they've smelt blood. We obviously have the 2-child cap, which will come up in future, and whether they realise or think we can get something out of this. Is there going to be further policy that they find unpalatable? Therefore, they go, we're going to dig our heels in on potential immigration reform further down the line. So I think I wouldn't say the concessions are a bad thing, because I think, you know, I think it was sensible to try and concede. I do think once the legislation goes through, there's probably going to be a rebellion of about 40, I reckon. It's going to face a legal challenge, because I cannot see how you can say you have Parkinson's, for instance, and you manage to go to work, but you receive PIP because obviously it's more expensive to have Parkinson's than to not have Parkinson's. Yeah. And you get a certain amount of PIP, then the legislation comes in, somebody else who's contracted Parkinson's signs on for PIP, they're going to get less money than the other person who's got exactly the same level of disability, which creates essentially a two-tier welfare state. And I don't see how that doesn't provoke a potential legal challenge on the rights of disabled people. So
when I mentioned Damien Green, who we spoke to yesterday, he made the point that forever, predating him and coming after any time he had in office, that's always apparently been a scenario that civil servants, I guess, throw up to ministers and say, look, these are your options. You know, we only got this amount of money. You can do that with it, or you can do that with it, as you know yourself, Matthew. And it's a tricky. No one says it's not a tricky one, but with this, I mean, you're right. It would seem, and that was the question I put to him. I said, surely someone's going to take that to court, aren't they? Look, the man down the road with Parkinson's gets £84 a week, and I get £44 a week. I mean, that cannot be surely legally sound.
No, exactly. And I think I've seen some of the backbenchers say, you know, they've not been courageous enough to try and admit that there needs to be an element of welfare reform. I think most sensible would say that the welfare bill is bloated. You know, there's a hell of a lot of money. We've seen a huge increase since COVID, and I think that's messed a lot of people up. But ultimately, you have to remember that MPs, you know, have jobs themselves. And I was privy to data last week that showed that there is 50 MPs, Labour backbench MPs, that have smaller majorities than the PIP claimant count in their constituency.
Yeah, I saw that.
Now, if you were to extrapolate that data and we were to presume this goes through, disabled people very upset, obviously. If that was to influence 2 people in their lives, whether that be friends or family members, you're looking at probably 280 Labour MPs that would lose their seats. So there's an element of self-preservation about this. The thing that worries me is it's not going to go away. And you may have seen on the front page of the Times yesterday that 30,000 entry-level jobs have just basically disappeared because robots are now doing them, lawyers have found. Well, that, for me, shows a bigger long-term plan of the robots are clearly at some point, AI is going to run a lot of our lives. What do we do for people who have no work?
Well, indeed. I mean, this is, and even if you look at places now, I can't remember if it was Blackpool, I'm pretty sure it was, something like 25%, a quarter of the town not working. Other areas, 1 in 10 people on some sort of disability benefit. Now, we can either go full on kind of Telegraph here and go, you know, that it cannot be that all of those people, a quarter of people are not working in a place where we got God knows how many vacancies. They're all over the place, vacancies. I know that not everyone's circumstances fits every vacancy. Is there some of that in it? Because every time I put that to a minister or somebody, they say, yeah, there is, of course, there always is a bit of that, but not enough to make a sizable difference.
Well, a sizable difference would be interesting because the estimates of the amount we lose in benefit fraud is £5 billion, which is what the government was aiming to save on this. I think they would have pleased more politicians and Joe Public by saying, right, we're going to invest in a load of DWP investigative staff and we're going to send them out and we're going to get all this money back. And you could even tie it in as a political ploy of the Tories and PPE and that's gone away. You'd say it'll pay for itself because we'll get it back. That's how I'd maybe have done it.
All right, Matthew, great to have you on. Thank you. Matthew Torbitt, former Labour advisor.